Before the fall, the chained god spoke, and the progenitor whispered its reply.
I will be free,
The chained god said.
and all will perish.
Perish, the progenitor whispered, an echo in the desolate infinity of the chained god's prison. The chained god formed a hand of darkness and bone, and stretched a finger towards the glowing liquid. Its light turned the darkness of his substance to blood.
They will drown in blood,
He said. Blood, whispered the progenitor. His finger touched the liquid's surface, and it sprang to life at his touch, coiling around the bone and joining with his shadow, hungry for his substance. Once again the chained god saw what it was and what it had been. He saw the world crumbling as it consumed everything, leaving behind only the void that was his prison.
So it shall be,
He said, his voice the only sound in the whole of void. All will perish, the progenitor whispered. The Fire Lord will consume the world. Nowhere watched a blast of flames roar from one of the cultist's outstretched hands and wash over his companions. Brandis raised his shield to block the brunt of the flames, and nowhere saw a hint of the divine glow that indicated the paladin's magic at work, protecting himself and the Eladrin wizard behind him from the searing heat. He allowed a hint of a smile to touch his lips as the echo of the blast faded in the strange vault beneath the capital. Brandis and Sharina could take care of themselves. That was why he liked working with them. They didn't need him. He didn't need them, except occasionally to distract their opponents long enough for him to get close. Like now. The might of the gods stands against you and your Fire Lord, Brandis said, raising his sword and striding towards the red-robed cultist. Nowhere slid the wavy-bladed dagger from his belt in perfect silence and assessed the three cultists. The nearest one, shrinking back from Brandis's approach, was a portly man whose bald head bore tattoos in patterns of flame. The one who had shouted his defiance and blasted fire at Brandis and Sharina was a small man with squinting eyes and a thin beard, clutching a staff and muttering invocations to the Fire Lord. The third cultist was a hulking brute with a huge iron sword that trailed fire as he swung it at the paladin. With all three cultists glaring at Brandis, Nowhere stepped silently behind the portly one. Nowhere and his companions had been working to root out this cult of fire worshippers for weeks. And he had more than one painful injury to repay, not even to speak of the building the cultists had burned to the ground, the wares and treasures consumed in flame. He lined up his attack in an instant and drove his dagger into the target's spine. A gurgling scream rose in the man's throat, cut short as Nowhere pulled the blade back and drew it quickly across the cultist's neck. The muttering cultist turned in surprise, and his squinting eyes widened as he saw Nowhere's horns and the bony ridge of his jaw. "A tiefling," the cultist said. "Heir of fallen Baal Torath, why not cast your lot with us? What love can you bear for this world?" Nowhere shrugged. "I don't see any profit in your line of thinking. There's great deal to like in this world." "Our reward lies not in this world, but in what remains when it's gone." The cultist punctuated his words by thrusting his hand towards Nowhere, palm first. Another blast of flame sprang towards the spot where Nowhere had been standing, but the tiefling was already in motion, rolling away from the fire, and coming to his feet right beside the startled cultist. "You expect a reward from the primordial monster that burns the world to ash?" Nowhere stabbed with his blade, cutting a gash in the cultist's arm as the man tried to twist away. "I don't think the primordials work that way." "You think the gods are any better?" The cultist had produced a dagger of his own, but he held it clumsily and seemed more interested in opening the distance between them than landing a solid blow. "I never said that," Nowhere said, and his blade found a home in the cultist's neck. "Nowhere!" The tiefling spun at the paladin's shout, then dropped into a crouch below the third cultist's sword, which came swirling over him in a tempest of fire. The heat of the flames trailing from the iron sword still seared his skin, and he threw himself backward to find a safe distance. The cultist's hood had fallen back from his face to reveal the monstrous visage of a hobgoblin, marked with scars in the fashion of the warlords of the Dragon Down Coast, far to the east. Nowhere frowned. Brandis had been sure that this fire cult was a local problem, nothing more than a few malcontents stirring up trouble in the underbelly of the capital. But if it was drawing members or other support from the eastern warlords, it might be far more. A bolt of crackling lightning shot from Sharina's slender fingers to engulf the hobgoblin, searing his skin and sending a wave of convulsions through his body. Brandis took the opportunity of the hobgoblin's momentary paralysis to step forward and swing his sword cleanly through the hobgoblin's neck. Sharina rubbed her hands together, as though the lightning joining her fingers to the dead hobgoblin could have carried the cultist's corruption to her.
"Are any of them still alive?"
she asked, nodding towards the ones Nowhere had dispatched. "No," the tiefling said, frowning. "I thought we'd question the big one." Brandis scowled. "Sorry," he said. "I figured the one with the staff was the leader."
"Well, one of you should search them,"
Sharina said, her lips curled in disgust.
"See if there's anything that might identify other cult members."
"Nowhere?" Brandis said, with pleasure. A buzzing fly brought Albrecht close to consciousness for a moment. He waved a hand uselessly near his head and sank back into dreaming. He dreamed he was covered in flies, swarming around him, drinking at his eyes and mouth, laying their eggs in his ears and his open wounds. Then he was the flies, his consciousness fractured into thousands of tiny minds, all sharing a single purpose, to feast on flesh. Then he was a man once more, and the world was a fleshy body beneath him. He joined with a swarm of all living things to consume the world. As they ate and ate, gorging themselves on the flesh of the world, what was left in its place was fire and chaos, a swirling maelstrom of annihilation. He slipped from the carcass of the world and fell into the maelstrom. He looked down its yawning gullet, and there he saw the eye. It was a roiling mass of shadow, with numberless dark tendrils writhing out of it, reaching towards him as he fell. It bore no pupil, no colored ring of iris, nothing that made it resemble the eye of any living thing. But it saw Albrecht, was seen, and he was empty before it. Its tentacles coiled around him and slowed his fall, and they whispered their secrets to him. He strained to hear and understand, but most of what they said was beyond his understanding. Another fly buzzed in his ear, and Albrecht sat up, looking wildly around him. "Beltoreth," he said, panting, "the living gate." "What is this symbol?" Brandis said, putting the letter into Sharina's outstretched hand. The Eladrin wizard studied the parchment, focusing her attention on the fiery eye traced at the bottom of the page.
The Elder Elemental Eye,
she said. Fear tinged her voice, and nowhere saw Brandis react to the name. Should I know what that means? The tiefling asked. It means our problem isn't confined to this little cult of fire lovers, Brandis said. Nowhere pointed to the corpse of the hobgoblin who had carried the letter. I thought he made that pretty clear. If they were drawing members from the Dragon Down coast, it's obviously not a local problem. But what is the Elemental Eye? Sharina's eyes were unfocused, an expression she adopted when deep in thought. It always gave Nowhere the impression that she was staring into a space between worlds, somehow, or perhaps peering into her home in the Feywild. When she didn't answer, Brandis shrugged. I'm not exactly sure, the paladin said. It's some kind of primordial force. I think some of the more malign primordials are set to work with it, or maybe even for it, including Imix the Fire Lord these scum were so excited about. Brandis's eyes strayed to the idol the cultists had erected here in their makeshift temple, a vaguely humanoid shape roughly formed from clay. Nowhere guessed that the crude protrusions along the figure's shoulders and the top of its head were supposed to indicate that the figure was burning, or perhaps made of fire. What the cultists lacked in artistic skill, Nowhere thought, they made up for in fanatic devotion. They were ready enough to die for their cause. Nowhere scratched his bony chin. The letter suggests they're trying to bring their master, the Elemental Eye, I presume, into the world. Terror and destruction follow in his wake, of course, he said. It sounds like the same dire-sounding rhetoric these fire cultists were spewing, so why do you look so worried? Brandis sighed and got to his feet, turning away from the others. I was so sure that we were just facing a local cult of troublemakers, expressing their discontent with the Empire's firm and steady hand. By claiming the Fire Lord as their patron, I miscalculated and led us into conflict with a much larger threat. You don't like being wrong, Nowhere said. He'd known that about Brandis for years. The paladin turned back to face him, his face grim. Especially not when lives are at stake.
We need to find whoever sent this letter,
Sharina said, emerging from her musing.
This dreaming prophet, as he calls himself.
Tomorrow, Nowhere said. After we sell the brass candlesticks and the ruby on the one's finger and celebrate our victory over the coat of the Fire Lord, right? He looked to Brandis for support, even though the paladin wasn't much for the kind of celebration Nowhere enjoyed. Brandis's eyes were fixed on the wizard.
Now,
Sharina said, and there was an urgency in her voice that squelched the argument in Nowhere's throat. A second city with its own wards and laws and commerce thrived in the storm sewers and ancient tunnels beneath Nerath's grand capital. Nowhere was as comfortable in the maze of its chambers and passages as he was in the equally labyrinthine streets on the surface. He'd spent most of his life moving between the surface world and the Undercity. Brandis and Serena were not so comfortable in the world of torchlight and refuse, but their long hunt for the arsonists and murderers that made up the Fire Lord's cult had forced even the two of them to learn the Undercity's ways. Nowhere had made sure of that. He couldn't have them relying on him to guide them. So even though he saw the trepidation in their eyes when he suggested that they split up, he knew they could handle themselves. Either of the two informants that had pointed them to the Fire Lord's temple might be able to lead them to the dreaming prophet. If the matter was as urgent as Sharina suggested, it would be best to speak to both informants at the same time. Brandis and Sharina would talk to the tavern keeper who had observed some of the cult's members' clandestine meetings, and nowhere would pay a visit to the other, the Night Hag. Taveth the Heartless lived in a sprawling network of natural caverns in the deeper reaches of the Undercity known, prosaically enough, as the Caves. Her fame as an information broker was exceeded only by her infamous cruelty. It was said that she stole secrets from prominent figures of the Undercity and even the city above by infiltrating their dreams. Nowhere approached her cavern home with every sense alert for danger in the deep shadows that surrounded him. He stopped just outside the entrance to her cave and opened the sack he carried. The smell of blood assaulted his nostrils as he drew out the bundle he'd purchased from a butcher in the nearby Gloomside district. "Blood and flesh for Taveth the Heartless," he called. He opened the package, took the blood-drenched cow's heart in one hand, and held it forward. He imagined he could feel a hint of resistance in the air as his hand crossed the threshold of her lair, but the blood parted the barrier. Suddenly the cavern beyond didn't seem quite as dark, and he saw the misshapen shadow of the Night Hag's body shambling towards him.
"Drop it."
Her voice was the croak of a bullfrog and the howl of a wolf, all the unnerving sounds of night wrapped around two small words. Nowhere let the heart fall on the ground and turned his back. He heard the hag shuffle forward and try to stop listening, but he couldn't block the sounds of her bloody feast.
"Enter,"
she said when she was done. Nowhere turned back to the cave mouth, and the Night Hag was lost in the darkness again. Steeling his nerves, he stepped across the threshold.
"You come alone this time?"
"I do not wish to try your patience again," Nowhere said. Taveth and Brandis had not gotten along well on their previous visit.
"Or perhaps you seek a bargain your friend would not condone."
Her voice came from all around him and echoed in the small cave. Nowhere peered into the shadows, trying to find a hint of the Night Hag's outline, although he saw far more than Brandis's. Human eyes could have. He could not find a trace of her. "I need more information," he said.
"You found the head of your little fire cult and discovered that it was just the hand of a much larger cult. Now you seek another head."
"That's right," Nowhere said. She'd made a logical deduction based on the information they sought last time, and what she knew about the situation, nothing more. And whether she meant to or not, she'd revealed that she had the information he wanted.
"When will it stop?"
The Night Hag asked.
"When you find out that the next head is just another hand, you will seek the next head, and the next."
My companions believed the Fire Lord's cult was part of a larger cult, serving something called the Elder Elemental Eye, and that cult seeks to unleash its master on the world.
"What do you believe?"
I pulled a ruby ring off one of these cultists that could ransom the Emperor's third son. As long as they want to keep hunting heads, I'll come along for the ride.
"And you are willing to continue paying the price I ask?"
If you keep providing information we can use, I'll continue paying for it. We're looking for someone called the Dreaming Prophet. You're an expert on dreams, I've heard. So do you know where we can find this person?
"I want Sharina."
What? Nowhere's voice cracked around a lump that formed suddenly in his throat. The Night Hag laughed, a barking croak that filled the cavern.
"Not this time, Tiefling, but eventually. No meat is as sweet to me as the flesh of a fair fey princess."
No, I won't hand her over to you.
"We shall see. In the meantime, I can tell you where to find the Dreaming Prophet for a very reasonable price. But when you find this head and start looking for the next, and the next after that, consider carefully how much you are willing to pay.
Flee now.
Albrecht awoke from his dream and leapt from the filthy pile of straw and fur he used as a bed. He started to gather his belongings, but as soon as his fingers touched the golden symbol of the Elder Elemental Eye, the voice from his dream resounded in his mind again.
Now.
He seized the medallion and bolted from the filth and squalor that had been his home and his temple for the past 3 years into the stench and decay of the city's sewers. Without a backwards glance, he hurried away at the dark god's bidding, intent on the task before him. Brandis braced himself against the stench and kicked open the flimsy door. "He's gone," Nowhere said. The tiefling moved into the tiny room, his eyes darting to every crevice. He stopped over the wretched bed and placed a hand gingerly on the furs. "It's still warm. We must have just missed him." "We could wait for him," Brandis said. "He's sure to be back with all this junk still here." Sharina knelt beside a pile of loose pages, beside one wall, and began leafing through the papers. "How can anyone live like this?" Brandis wondered aloud. "Most people don't have a choice," Nowhere said. "We weren't all born in the sunlight." "No, but there must be other options," the paladin said. "Even the worst parts of the surface city are better than this." "Not much better. And where is a lunatic cult leader going to find a respectable lodging?" "Fair point," Brandis said. Sharina stood up, still holding a large sheet of parchment.
"Well," she said, "I don't think he's coming back here."
"Why not?" Nowhere asked. The Eladrin held up the parchment, and Nowhere and Brandis stepped closer to peer at the writing that covered every inch of it. Dense columns of cramping text sent Nowhere's mind reeling as he tried to absorb the ravings of a mad cultist, the dreaming prophet. Images of swarming flies and feasting maggots leaped from the text to assault his thoughts, and the proclamation of the world's doom ran like a steady drone beneath the maddening melody of the text. But 5 words appeared over and over, scrolled in the margins and written in a large hand across the page. "Bel-Terath, the living gate." Nowhere sighed. "I suppose we're going to Bel-Terath." Bel-Terath.
"Flee.
The chained god whispered.
Now."
He filled his thought with the image of the living gate, the tiny fragment of its substance that lay hidden in the ruins of Bel-Terath, and sent those thoughts through the void along the fragile connection between himself and his mortal servant.
"Now."
He roared. His voice echoed in the void, and the whispers of the progenitor rose around him. "Now," it said, slithering in the utter darkness. "Free." The chained god gazed around at the red liquid crystal that swirled and undulated around him.
"You will go before me to become the living gate,"
he said,
"to open my way to freedom."
He formed a hand from the darkness of his substance and lifted a portion of the progenitor's substance. Tiny droplets of the red liquid trailed from his hand, shimmering in their own light. The fluid in his hand coiled around him, seeking something it could infuse and transform, but the chained god was not flesh or matter. He brought it close and whispered over it, his frozen breath forming patterns of crystal across its surface.
"They will drown in blood,"
he whispered, a familiar refrain. All around him the progenitor responded, "All will perish." Miri walked with her axe clutched in both hands, its thick haft resting on her shoulder, ready to swing at anyone or anything that jumped out at them in the ruins. The jagged spires and crumbling walls of Abyssal Plague loomed around her like a nightmare landscape, devils' faces leering at her from ancient columns. It wasn't so much the architecture and its grotesquerie that set her on edge, but a less tangible sense, an awareness of an evil history that brooded over the ruined city. It was within its walls, she knew, that the noble houses of the ancient empire that bore the city's name had struck their fateful bargain with the powers of the 9 hells, infusing their blood with a diabolical taint that persisted in the descendants of those houses, no longer human, but a race unto themselves, the tieflings. Such monstrous corruption had left its mark on the city, or at least she imagined it had. It made her flesh crawl and set her nerves on edge.
The sooner we find this thing and destroy it and get out of here, the happier I'll be,
she whispered. I know, Demas said, his voice as clear as a trumpet and almost as loud. Miri flinched at his volume, afraid what attention it might draw to their presence. She watched as he turned back away from her, his eyes searching the rubble ahead for any sign he might recognize from his strange and haunting dreams. She sighed, not for the first time. She wished she understood him better, that she had even a taste of whatever it was that made him always so calm, so sure, so at peace. His walk with the iron had made him more than human, rather like an angel given mortal form. His pale skin marked with jagged patterns as red as blood set him apart from ordinary men. But the grace and calm that suffused his every word, his every movement, seemed like an image of the divine. When he was moved to wrath or compassion, an ion's power flowed through him to smite his foes or comfort and strengthen his allies. She imagined she could see the eyes of the goddess in his beautiful face, and he walked in the path she laid out for him, confident and trusting. He continued forward, following the visions Ion had granted him, and she walked close behind. She wasn't sure how much his eyes saw the ruins around them, and how much he was gazing into another world, so she would be his eyes, alert to danger. His eyes and ears. She put her hand on his shoulder to stop him, and put a finger to her lips to silence the question that rose to his lips. In the stillness she heard it again more clearly, the clash of steel.
There is battle going on,
she said. Damas nodded. Monstrous creatures haunt these ruins, and worse, someone could be in trouble.
Who? No one lives here anymore, right?
Treasure hunters, perhaps, or fugitives using the ruins as a hiding place. But even such unsavory characters do not deserve the death that haunts this place. Miri smiled at him.
I knew you'd say that.
She started walking towards the sound, just to the right of the course they'd been on.
This way.
It felt good to lead the way for a change, to know the right course and be able to guide him, as he so often guided her. She had known nothing of battle before she met Demas, but now she was as comfortable with her axe as she'd been with her milk pail before so long ago. Whatever dangers lay ahead, at least it was a threat she could understand, one she knew how to face. And with Demas behind her, his divine power filling the air around her, she felt ready to face any danger. The sounds of combat grew louder, steel crashing against steel, the shouts of men and growls and roars that came from no human throat. Miri hurried onward until she rounded a corner, and the battle engulfed her. A man lay on the ground at her feet, blood spilling from a wound in his throat that might never heal. 3 others, 2 humans and 1 stout dwarf, stood in a tight ring, beset on all sides by creatures of nightmare. 6 of the creatures looked almost like men, clad in armor of black iron plates but their legs were bent like those of a beast, tipped with great scale claws, and Miri realized with a start that the horns on their heads were not part of any helmet, but their own monstrous ornament. Reddish-brown tails lashed the air behind them as they closed in on the desperate defenders. The other creature was a gaunt figure that towered over the others. Leathery skin stretched tight over its bones from its claw-tipped feet to its strangely wrapped skull. A thin tail curled up behind it, and an enormous stinger like that of a scorpion hovered near its head, ready to stab downward at its foes. Miri glanced back at Damas as he rounded the corner and took in the scene. He smiled at her, then bent to intone a prayer over the dying man. Miri had all the reassurance she needed. She charged the towering devil, running forward and putting all her strength and momentum into one great swing of her axe. The blade bit deep into the creature's side and erupted in blinding white light, the product of Damas's blessing. The devil howled as he turned to face her, its flesh burning away from the wound as pale green ichor spilled out. As its eyes fell on her, Miri's confidence faltered. Fear surged in her chest, sending her heart hammering against her ribs, and a chill into the pit of her stomach. Some part of her mind tried to assert that the fear was just a trick of the devil's magic, but the rest screamed at her to flee. One of the devil's enormous claws came swinging at her, and she scrambled backward just out of its reach. She wanted nothing more than to keep going, to turn around and run as fast as her legs could take her. Then a column of white flame streamed down from the slate-gray sky and engulfed the battlefield. The radiant flames danced over the towering devil's body, licking at its leathery skin, and it howled in rage and agony. The smaller devils shrieked in pain as well, and 3 of them rolled on the ground in a desperate, futile attempt to stifle the holy fire before it consumed them. To Miri, though, the flames were soft and comforting, banishing her fear. She could feel the warmth of Damas's smile in the flames. The 3 men looked bewildered as the flames washed down around them, searing their foes but leaving them untouched. Miri noticed that they did not seem to draw comfort from the divine power as she did, and she wondered briefly who they were and what business had brought them into the ruins of the Tiefling capital. Then the bony devil's stinger stabbed into her shoulder. An agony like nothing she had ever known coursed through her body. Nowhere had dreamed of Baal Tereth, especially in his childhood. In his dreams, though, he'd seen stately mansions and soaring towers. The city as he imagined it had stood at the height of its empire, proud, majestic, and deadly. In every dream, he walked unnoticed through the bustling streets until he came to a certain manor house, dark and squat in contrast to the towering buildings around it. As soon as he opened the manor's door, the city fell into ruin and fiends of the 9 hells assaulted him from every side, waking him from his dream in a surge of terror. Echoes of that terror shook his resolve as he and his companions strode through the crumbled gates of the city. His eyes darted around, peering into every crevice and shadow, half expecting some creature out of nightmare to leap out and attack. He could see tension in Brandish's shoulders and how tightly the paladin gripped his sword, and wondered whether Brandish was also haunted by old nightmares. Sharina, though, seemed completely undaunted by the ancient ruins, or completely unaware of them. She'd been holding the cultist's parchment inches from her nose for most of the journey, as if by sheer force of will she could command it to reveal the secrets hidden behind the words. She somehow managed to glide over the rubble with her customary grace, even with her eyes fixed on the parchment. Sharina nowhere whispered, "What have you learned? Have you figured out what we're looking for?"
Cultists,
she said, not looking up from the parchment.
Are a fragment of the living gate.
I thought maybe after all that reading you had picked up something more than what the big words said. Sharina shot him a withering glance before returning her gaze to the parchment.
You asked 2 questions. I chose to answer the second.
Then you have learned more?
Nothing good.
She sighed and lowered the parchment, looking around as if noticing for the first time that they had reached the ruins.
They're looking for a fragment of the living gate, so they can use it in a ritual designed to pierce the barrier between worlds. The bulk of this writing is the formulas of the ritual. They intend to pierce the walls of the Elder Elemental's Eyes prison, so it can free itself.
Will it work? Brandis asked.
That's just it. The ritual seems coherent from what I can make out. But some of the components and formulas don't make sense if the place they're trying to reach is a Primordial's prison, somewhere in the elemental chaos.
So, maybe the ritual will work, but not as they plan, Nowhere said. Maybe they'll bring something else through their portal instead of the primordial they intend.
Something else,
Sharina said.
Something worse.
Worse? Brandis said. What could be worse than a primordial? The gods themselves joined in bands of 3 or 5 to bring down a single primordial in the Dawn War.
Most primordials are much weakened since the Dawn War,
Sharina said.
And some forces are even stronger than the primordials were at the height of their power.
Nowhere frowned. Get to the point, Sharina. What are we facing? She glared at him.
The cultists plan to take this fragment of the living gate to Pandemonium and perform their ritual there. Pandemonium was the dominion of a god so evil and so powerful that all the other gods banded together to imprison him. I believe that can mean only one thing. These cultists hope to free the chained god.
Brandis' eyes went wide. That's madness. Of course it is, Nowhere said. Just like the cultists serving the Fire Lord in Nera were mad. It just means we'd better make sure we stop them. Miri stared up at the gaunt devil's leering face as the venom seared through her veins. Darkness closed around her vision until its visage was all she could see. It shifted, reaching one of its enormous claws towards her. Brilliant light engulfed her and the devil, casting stark shadows across its angular face as it howled in pain. The fire in Miri's veins became a refreshing warmth, washing through her. Tema's divine power, repairing the damage the poison had caused. She gripped her axe and swung it with all her might at the devil's bony leg. The blade bit deep, spraying green ichor and splintering bone, knocking the creature's leg out from under it and sending it sprawling to the ground. She stepped clear of its flailing tail, glancing around to get a sense of the field. 2 of the smaller devils were circling around her, either moving in to attack from her flanks or trying to get past her to Demas. The other 4 lay dead on the ground. She saw no sign of the 3 men she'd been trying to rescue, and she frowned. No time to worry about that now, she told herself. She threw herself in the path of one of the smaller devils, lashing out with a mighty swing of her axe. The blade glanced off the creature's heavy armor, but the force of the blow sent it staggering across the crumbling cobblestones, and it crashed into its companion. Demas sent another burst of divine radiance to consume the devils, and they were gone. The larger one gingerly got off to its clawed feet, favoring the leg Miri had struck. Its tail weaved in the air behind it like a snake ready to strike, and it roared in pain and fury. The devil's eyes were tiny points of yellow light sunk deep in gaping black sockets, and it fixed them on Demas. "Your god will not protect you where you are going, cleric," it called. Silence! Demas answered, his voice charged with divine authority. "My god is the weaver of fate and the voice of prophecy. Do not think that your knowledge surpasses my own." He lifted his staff in both hands over his head, and the pure light of the sun washed out from him. The devil recoiled, shielding his eyes from the divine light, and Miri rushed forward again. With one swing, she swept the devil's feet out from under it again. She spun with the momentum of her axe, then brought it down to cleave the monster's head from its bony neck. "Well done, child," Demas said. Miri's heart swelled with pride, even as tears prickled at her eyes. Why couldn't he see her as something more than a child? "It appears our rescue attempt was successful," the cleric continued. "Even the one who was dying, they all escaped." Miri frowned.
Why did they take off like that?
"You felt the fear the Bone Devil inspired," Demas said.
True. Maybe they'll come back to thank us, once the fear wears off.
"I wouldn't stand around waiting." Miri sighed, irritated.
That thing could have killed me. I can still taste the poison.
"We did the right thing. They needed our help and we gave it,"
It is still the right thing even if they're ungrateful wretches.
Miri said. Demas smiled and her anger melted away. Even then. Garrick ran with his hands to his throat, as if he still couldn't believe that his head was still attached to his body. When he caught up with the others, Haver clapped him on the shoulder. "I thought you were dead," Haver said. "So did I," Garrick growled. He didn't meet Haver's gaze. "The cleric healed me." "We're still half the numbers we were when we came to this wretched place," Albrecht said, glaring to his three acolytes. "The Elder Elemental Eye expects more from its servants." All three bit their tongues and bowed their heads, though Albrecht caught a flash of anger in Forgrim's eyes. He would have to watch the dwarf. His stubborn pride would be the obstacle to his service of the Eye. "While those bold and foolish heroes deal with the devils," Albrecht said, "the Eye will lead us to the object we seek." He reached beneath his heavy mantle and pulled out the golden spiral symbol he wore, his connection to the Elder Elemental Eye. His fingers tingled as he touched the warm metal, and his head swarmed at the edge of a dream. "Follow me wherever I lead, but be on your guard." He closed his eyes and lost all connection to the world around him. The ruined city fell away, and he stood in a vast silver sea. Stars glimmered in the midst of a fine silvery mist that swirled around his legs. He turned around, looking for a path, and a stream of midnight blue formed from his feet, stretching off into the hazy distance. He walked along the stream, letting its flow carry him as the silvery dream around him turned into a nightmare. The misty sea on either side fell away, into a swirling maelstrom, flashing with fire and lightning. The stream became a narrow bridge, and the reek of death wafted up from the abyss on either side, making him dizzy with nausea. He clutched the eye symbol to his chest and put one foot carefully in front of the other. Shadows drifted up from the maelstroms along his path, and he heard as if from a great distance the shouts of his acolytes, sharp with terror. The shadows, great winged forms like demons or dragons, menaced but did not attack, and though he felt the acolytes drawing closer to him, they did not try to rouse him. One foot in front of the other, he followed the path the elemental eye set out for him. The path began to descend, and darkness rose up around him on all sides. Some kind of obstacle stood before him, but he reached out a hand and felt the Elder Elemental Eye's power coursing down his arm, erupting in a spray of vitriol that washed the barrier away. He stepped through the broken remnants of the door or wall and saw a blinding glow, blood red and cold as Stygia's icy sea. He threw his arm up to cover his eyes and woke from his dream. Albrecht stood in a tiny alcove cluttered with ruined masonry. His three acolytes clustered behind him, wide eyes fixed on him in awe and terror. He allowed the hint of a smile to touch his lips. They should fear him and the power that flowed through him. He turned back to find the source of the glow that blinded him in his dream, the object of his quest. A gnarled staff stood against the far wall of the small chamber, supported by two wooden braces attached to the wall. The staff itself was unremarkable, nothing more than a length of yew branch, worn smooth from the touch of many hands. At the heavy head a lattice of gut strings held a long slender shard of reddish crystal suspended in place, a shard of the living gate. Albrecht seized the staff in triumph, and felt a surge of joy that was not entirely his own. the elder elemental eye was pleased. Sigil. The joy of the chained god was a wild thing, fierce and manic, straining against the bounds of his prison. The merest hint of freedom, a whiff of possibility, filled him with savage delight. He could almost taste the annihilation of the world. Through his mortal servant he felt the power of the living gate. Even such a small piece of the crystal made the space between worlds thinner. In his servant's hands, the fragment would open a window to his prison. But the chained god would not be able to escape through a window of that size. Even though his power filled the desolate universe that was his prison, he could only send a fraction of his might and majesty, burrowing between worlds, if the living gate opened the way. And the progenitor would be the vehicle for that shard, like a wind that whips the sea's waves into foam. He swept over the surface of the progenitor, sending ripples and shivers through the liquid crystal. With a thought, he lifted a portion of its substance into a sphere that hovered in the void. Red and silver lightning sparked and crackled around it as the chained god exerted his will, infusing it with a tiny portion of himself.
We will soon be free.
The voice was his, and it was the whisper of the progenitor.
Free to consume and destroy.
It was all around, and it was distilled in the hovering orb.
Free to drown the world in blood.
The ruins of Baal-Tereth had already proven dangerous. Just a few hours earlier, Miri and Demas had come across a group of treasure hunters engaged in a fierce battle with a bone devil and its minions. Miri shook her head at the memory. The adventurers had fled while she and Demas fought the devils. Even the one Demas had saved from certain death had run off without a word of thanks. Footsteps crunched on gravel somewhere close by, in the ruins. Miri held up her hand to signal a stop.
Someone's coming,
she whispered. Yes, Demas said. Ion has sent us aid. She turned an arched eyebrow at him. His pale face was serene and confident as always. A champion of Pelor and 2 companions, Demas said. They will help us find the Staff of Opening if it's not too late.
Ion told you this?
Miri asked. Of course. Miri smiled. Demas was so enlightened in some ways, and so naive in others. He accepted Ion's gifts of prophecy without question, and apparently without even recognizing how unusual they were.
Shall I hail them then?
Yes, his name is Brandis. Nowhere stepped in his tracks and gaped at the young woman who just emerged from the ruins, smiling, waving, and calling out to his paladin friend. He slowly turned and looked at Brandis. The paladin looked bewildered. You know this woman, Brandis? Nowhere asked. Ever seen her before in my life? His eyes narrowed as he stared at the woman.
She could be a devil,
Sharina whispered.
Reading our minds to learn your name, ready to beguile and manipulate us all.
I don't think she's a devil, Brandis muttered, absently touching the sun symbol of Pelor he wore at his chest. Nowhere scoffed and found a position behind a crumbling wall, where the woman, devil or half-devil or whatever she was, couldn't see him. If she couldn't see him, she probably couldn't touch his mind, he figured, and he preferred to be out of sight when a fight broke out anyway. He heard the woman walking closer and another set of footsteps behind her. That's far enough, Brandis called. Who are you?
My name is Miri,
the woman said. I am Damascus, the sword of the gods. His voice was loud and pure, as much the blast of a trumpet as it was the speech of a man. Damascus? Brandis said. Nowhere peered around the corner of the wall to see the paladin, whose brow was furrowed. His hand rested idly on the sunburst symbol of Pelor he wore around his neck. and he seemed deep in thought. Finally, Brandis looked up. "Have we met before?" he asked Damascus. "We have not, but I am known to my confidence as Demas. The urging you are experiencing is the voice of Pelor. Heed it." Nowhere still couldn't see the newcomers, but he watched Brandis bow his head as if trying to hear a distant voice. Sharina stepped up beside the paladin.
"We are in a city haunted by devils,"
she said.
"What assurances can you give us that you are not beguiling fiends who read our thoughts and sap our wills?"
Nowhere slid his dagger from his belt in perfect silence and stared at the razor-sharp edge. "I can give no such assurance," the man said. "Devils are creatures of deception. There is no truth I can utter that a devil could not feign. You must trust your paladin's heart, if he can listen to the voice of truth whispering in his breast." Sharina looked to Brandis, but the paladin's eyes were closed, his hand clenched around his holy symbol. Nowhere padded to the other end of the wall and peered around the corner, trying to get a good look at the man who called himself the Sword of the Gods. Demas's skin was unearthly pale, except where it was marked with jagged tattoos of scarlet. He was tall and regal in his bearing, and as Nowhere watched, he took a few graceful steps closer to Brandis and Sharina. He carried a smooth golden staff, but a heavy greatsword hung sheathed on his back. "What does Pelor tell you, Brandis?" Demas asked. Brandis opened his eyes, but his brow remained furrowed and his speech was hesitant. "That you are indeed the Sword of the Gods," he said. "That we share a common purpose in these ruins." He shook his head. "And that you are chasing your doom." For the first time, Demas looked ruffled, and he shot a glance at Miri. "Speak no more of that," he said. "Ion has shown me the path I follow." Brandis regarded Demas for a moment more, then extended his hand. "I am glad to find you in this God-forsaken place, friend." Demas clasped the paladin's hand. "Not God-forsaken, paladin. You and I carry their presence with us, even here." "My companions," Brandis said, nodding towards the Eladrin. "Sharina, and where is he?" "Behind that wall." Demas turned and his gaze fell on Nowhere. There wasn't an instant of searching in his gaze. He'd known exactly where the tiefling was before he even turned. Nowhere stepped out from his hiding place stunned. "How long did you know I was there?" "Nothing hides from the searching gaze of Ion, my friend." Miri, at least, seemed surprised at Nowhere's sudden appearance. She started when he emerged from his hiding place, and her brow furrowed as she took in his horns, his jagged jawline, the reddish cast of his skin, and the long tail that snarked behind him. He scowled back at her, then turned it on Demas. "Few call me friend until they've proven it," he said. "The divine whispers that only you two can hear mean nothing to me." Miri turned on Sharina.
"You accuse us of being devils while keeping company with him? A devil walking in mortal flesh."
Sharina shrugged.
"I neither know nor care what's in his heart. He has proven himself reliable and trustworthy. I can ask only for similar proof from you."
Nowhere ignored the twinge in his chest that her words provoked. "I won't stab you in the back unless you give me a reason to."
"A reason or an excuse?"
Miri asked. Nowhere took a step towards the half-elf, clutching his dagger tightly. "That depends on how long you continue being an arrogant self-righteous." "That's enough, Nowhere." Brandis interposed himself between him and Miri, putting a hand on the tiefling's chest. Nowhere batted his hand aside and turned away. "We have more important things to do," he said. "If the gods want those two to help, let them help. But while we stand here arguing, those cultists are getting closer to opening the living gate."
"Cultists?"
Miri asked. "The ungrateful wretches we helped earlier, no doubt," Demas said. Nowhere wheeled back to the newcomers. "You helped them?" "We helped a group of treasure hunters who were fighting a pack of devils. We didn't know. We still don't know that they were the cultists you're looking for." "Even with the aid of Ion's searching gaze?" Nowhere said. The important thing now is to find them, Brandis said, giving Nowhere a stern look. Demas nodded. And keep them from claiming the Staff of Opening. The self-proclaimed Sword of the Gods closed his eyes and turned away. Nowhere slid his dagger into its sheath to make sure he didn't slide it into Demas's sanctimonious back. Miri and Brandis both had their eyes fixed on Demas as if they expected a divine pronouncement. Sharina met Nowhere's glance and rolled her eyes, smiling. "Follow me," Demas said, starting to walk back the way they'd come. Nowhere smiled despite himself as he fell into position. Ulbrich lifted the staff reverently from its cradle on the wall. He slid his dagger from its sheath and used it to cut the strings that suspended the reddish crystal in place at the head of the staff. Cradling it in his hands, he discarded the smooth length of yew, letting it clatter to the floor of the ancient alcove. His 3 acolytes started with surprise at the sudden racket, but he ignored them, gazing at the crystal. He studied its complex facets, and his broken reflection that stared back at him as his heart hammered in his chest. He held a fragment of the living gate, shattered at the dawn of time. More importantly, he held the key to freeing the Elder Elemental Eye, and the surge of joy in his chest was at least partly the fierce joy of his god, about to taste his first breath of freedom in countless ages. "Now what?" Fargrim rumbled, wrenching Ulbrich's attention from the crystal. Ulbrich rose from his crouch to tower over the frowning dwarf, but Fargrim met his eyes without flinching. Ulbrich toyed with the idea of cutting the dwarf's throat right there, a quick slash of his dagger, faster than Fargrim could even see. But the ritual demanded more hands, not fewer. He fought down the violent impulse. "Now," Ulbrich said, "we open a path to the City of Doors, where we will find a way to our destination." Fargrim crossed his arms, his scowl deepening. "Why not just open a portal directly to our destination?" Fargrim closed his arms, his scowl deepening. "Why not just open a portal directly to our destination?" The urge to violence wailed in Ulbrich's gut again, and this time he gave in to it. The eye spoke through his urges, after all, and who was he to deny the will of the eye? His dagger flashed out and cut across the dwarf's throat. The scowl disappeared from Fargrim's face as his eyes and mouth opened. He choked and tried to cough, spraying blood onto Ulbrich and the crystal. Ulbrich turned away in disgust, using the hem of his cloak to wipe the blood from the shard of the living gate. He glared at Garrick and Haver, who were watching the dwarf die with disgusted horror on their faces. "Opening a portal to the howling waste of pandemonium is very difficult, especially in the absence of some object tied to the place. Opening a portal to the City of Doors is almost trivially simple. That's why they call it the City of Doors. Any other questions?" Garrick's hand absently rubbed his own throat. He didn't look at Ulbrich, but Haver did, madness in his eyes. "Victory to the Elder Elemental Eye," Haver blurted. "Victory and freedom," Ulbrich said. An echo of the eye's wild joy surged through his chest again, but it was tinged with a sense of urgency. "Now the portal. Enemies approach." His 2 acolytes snapped into alertness, weapons in hand and feet ready to move. They took up positions on either side of the branch in the wall that Ulbrich's magic had opened in the midst of his waking dream. Ulbrich turned to the wall where the staff had stood, closed his eyes in concentration, and drew in a deep breath. When he opened his eyes again, in place of the wall, he saw the weave of space, closely knit into an infinite and immutable tapestry. He lifted the fragment of the living gate and traced it in a large circle, scraping it over the stone wall. Where it passed, it cut the threads of the tapestry, and he felt the shifting currents of air in the room as the space changed. The great circle complete, he began tracing more intricate symbols within it, and other threads were drawn into the weave, strands of a different weave from a distant space, Almost finished, he heard Garrick's growl of warning, but didn't let it break his concentration. He formed the last symbols in the circle, blinked several times, and looked upon the streets of Sigil, the city of doors. "They're coming," Hever said. "And we're leaving." Albrecht stepped through the portal without a glance back at his acolytes. They would follow, or they would die. It didn't matter to him. Miri stayed close to Demas, trying to ensure that nothing surprised him as he led them through the ruins. Following Ion's inspiration, Brandis walked beside her in silence, a frown creasing his face. Each time she glanced aside at him, his eyes were fixed on Demas. What had his god told him about Demas? Ion was the god of prophecy, but clearly Paler had shown his paladin something of Demas's future, something terrible. She could tell that Demas knew it as well, and he was shielding her from it. The way he'd silenced Brandis and made that clear, that stung. Did he not trust her with that knowledge? Did he think she couldn't handle it? "In here," Demas announced, coming to a stop in front of a crumbling building. "There are 4 of..." His brow furrowed for an instant. "No, there are 3 of them, but we must make haste." "How does he do that?" Brandis asked Miri as Demas turned back to the building.
Do what?
"It's like Ion is right beside him, carrying on a conversation only he can hear. Like all her wisdom and knowledge is right at hand for him. It's amazing." Miri smiled.
Yes, it is.
The tiefling stepped between Miri and Brandis to follow Demas into the building. "Didn't he say something about haste?" he said, a wry smile on his brick-red face. Brandis scowled and stepped through the open doorway behind Nowhere. Miri followed with a glance back at the wizard Sharina, who glided along as though their little procession were a parade in her honor. Sharina didn't meet her gaze, and Miri suddenly felt very alone. She hurried to catch up with Demas before he reached the cultists. Nowhere let her slip past him, and she reached Brandis' side at the top of a short flight of stairs. "Hold!" Demas' voice echoed up from below, and a flash of brilliant light dazzled her eyes. As one, Miri and Brandis hurtled down the stairs. Demas stood before a hole in the masonry wall, his staff lifted high, a nimbus of divine power surrounding him like a storm. Brandis pushed past him, and Miri saw him run through what looked like a circular hole in the opposite wall. On the other side of that hole, rather than more crumbling walls and dim chambers, she could see the bustling streets of an unfamiliar city. She looked at Demas. "After them," he urged. His free hand was outstretched towards the portal. "I can't keep it open for long." Nowhere ran past them and followed Brandis through the portal, which Miri noticed was growing smaller as the city on the other side seemed to recede. Sharina paused at Demas' side.
I can help,
the Eladrin said, reaching her own hand towards the portal. "The far end is moving," Demas said. "Help me stabilize it."
What can I do?
Miri said. "Go through, child. Find the others."
What about you? We'll be right behind you,
Sharina said.
Hurry.
Miri ran to the portal and stepped into a crowded street. She couldn't see Brandis or Nowhere or the fleeing cultists. As she spun to look behind her, she saw only more city streets winding off into the distance.
Demas!
She shouted. People of every race, garbed in clothes and armor of every possible description, hurried past her in all directions, few even sparing her a glance.
Demas! Sharina!
She called again. She didn't see them, and no one answered her call. Brandis and the tiefling must have been long gone. She was in the middle of the largest city she had ever seen, and as far as she could tell, she was completely alone. Haver kept looking over his shoulder as he followed Albrecht through the twisting streets of the City of Doors, as if he expected the warriors who had chased them through the portal to appear at any moment. He accompanied his hurried steps with a constant stream of gloomy rumblings. Albrecht frowned. The madness of the Elder Elemental Eye was a precious gift, leading to insight and inspiration, but some minds could not handle it. He suspected that Haver would soon degenerate into raving, but not, he hoped, before fulfilling his role in the ritual. After that, Haver's sanity would cease to matter. Escaping their pursuers had been easy enough. The portal had begun to close as soon as Albrecht stepped through. Garrick and Haver followed quickly and appeared nearby, warning of the adventurers hot on their heels. But by the time the first warrior came through, the end of the portal had already begun to slide away, depositing him a dozen yards down the street, easily avoided. The others, if they made it through at all, would have emerged even further away. Even so, the fact of their pursuit was troubling. It appeared that other forces were moving against the Eye, seeking to prevent what Albrecht was trying to accomplish and keep the Eye imprisoned. A jolt of fury surged through his chest at the thought. They would not stop him. The Eye would destroy them all, even the gods who had first cast him into his prison. Albrecht stopped and leaned against a wall for a moment, closing his eyes and seeking insight from his master. His knees buckled as his mind drifted into dream, the Eye revealing in an instant what he needed to know. Garrick caught his arm and helped him find his feet. "The Elder Elemental Eye has 3 faithful followers here," he said. "They await us in the hive." "Only 3?" Garrick said. "That leaves us 2 short for the ritual." "The Eye will provide more hands for his labor. Do not question or we will be 3 short." Garrick released his arm and trailed behind as Albrecht led the way to the labyrinth of wretched tenements called the Hive. Like a sewer for the universe, the Hive was a collection of the dregs of countless societies, the most miserable of every world and plane. Half dreaming, Albrecht drifted through its maze of alleys. Even its thoroughfares couldn't be called streets, following the inspiration of the Eye. He smiled as 3 figures detached themselves from the filth piled against a crumbling wall, and took up positions before and behind them. Garrick shook his shoulder. "Albrecht," he said, "we're being robbed." The 3 figures, an elf woman, a dragon-born man, and a one-eyed human man, shared a chuckle. "That's right, Albrecht," the one-eyed man said. "Somebody not paying attention." Albrecht laughed with them, then produced a golden symbol of the Elder Eye from within the folds of his robe. The elf saw it and gasped. "You are the ones not paying attention," Albrecht said. "The Elder Elemental Eye commands your obedience." Behind him, the one-eyed man started to protest. "Look here, I don't know who told you." Albrecht spun to face the man and raised his arms. Dark lightning pulsed around the golden symbol like an extension of his heartbeat, and his voice filled with booming menace. "The Eye commands you. Heed his voice or die where you stand." The dragonborn fell to his knees without a word, and Albrecht heard the elf behind him do the same. The one-eyed man hesitated, and Albrecht started drawing in power for the invocation that would strike the faithless one down. But the man sank to his knees as well, an ecstatic smile twisting his face, his single eye wide with awe. Albrecht smiled. Here was one who saw. The others followed blindly, but this man was a dreamer, like himself. "What is your name?" he asked the man. The voice that came from the one-eyed man's mouth was different. It rang out as deep as thunder in a vast chasm, and the whispers of the mad and the damned echoed in the empty air.
"I am the Elder Elemental Eye,"
he said.
"I am the chained god."
Now Albrecht fell to his knees, staring in awe at the apparition of his god.
"My name is Starisdun."
Pandemonium. Joy and fury warred together within the shadowy substance of the chained god. The key to his prison was on its way to his former domain, the Isle of Madness in the Astral Sea, where it would open the doorway and welcome him home. Freedom had never been so close, not in the countless thousands of years stretching back almost to the dawn of time. He could taste it, feel it in the minds of his servants who were planning the ritual. He was so close to them that he could almost feel the dirt beneath his knees as he spoke through his servant.
My name is Taristun.
As close as his servants were, the other gods had servants of their own who seemed determined to interfere. Paler and Iron, gods of the Bright City, were maneuvering their pawns into position. Iron and Paler knew the secret of the Living Gate, a secret that only he shared of all living beings. Only the three of them had peered through the gate while its guardian slept so long ago. Back at the beginning of all things, were they afraid that he would destroy the universe as he had almost done before? Or did they fear the secret they kept? It didn't matter. The chained god roared, and the void of his prison echoed with a sound, sending ripples across the liquid surface of the progenitor. When he was free, the streets of the Bright City would run with the blood of its gods. Nowhere entered the portal mere seconds after Brandis, but after he'd stepped through, he found himself 100 yards behind the paladin, racing along a crowded street in an unfamiliar city. Although the gentle rise of the street gave him a good view, at least another 100 yards in front of Brandis, he couldn't see the cultists they'd been chasing. No one was even running in the same direction, which probably meant they had left the main road and disappeared into an alley or side street. "Brandis!" he shouted as he slowed to a jog. The paladin shot a glance over his shoulder, but he didn't seem to notice Nowhere in the crowd. He turned back and scanned the street ahead of him and began to slow his pace. Nowhere turned to the street behind him, looking for any sign of Sharina or the newcomers. No luck. He scratched his jaw and scowled. Sharina could take care of herself. She'd be all right. So why was he so distressed not to see her behind him? Nowhere couldn't tell whether Brandis, who had come to a stop and was now gaping around the city, was actually looking for the cultists or just admiring the sights. There was a lot to see. The architecture was eclectic, and people of every race thronged the street. Nowhere jogged until he caught up with the paladin. "What now, fearless leader?" he asked Brandis. Brandis creased his brow and looked up into the hazy gray sky. "Am I crazy?" he said. "Or is there more city up there?" Nowhere followed his gaze. He couldn't make out anything through the haze, but as he let his eyes drift back down, he noticed that the street they were on rose gently and kept rising. There was no crest to its hill. Eventually it disappeared into the smoky haze, but Nowhere had the distinct sense that it continued up and around. Perhaps Brandis was right, and the city actually formed an enormous ring. A few people who passed them on the street glanced upward to see what Brandis and Nowhere were looking at, but most continued on without breaking stride. But as Nowhere tilted his head back to stare into the haze again, he heard a chuckle from a well-dressed dwarf woman.
Welcome to Sigil, boys,
she said with a wink. She continued on her way, leaving Brandis gaping after her. "Sigil?" he said. "Where in the world is Sigil?" "The City of Doors, it's sometimes called," Nowhere said. "They say it's not the world at all, but it's not in the other plane either." "So you should feel right at home," Brandis said with a wry grin. "We're nowhere." Nowhere paid no heed. How many times had he heard similar jokes? Still, there was some truth to it. Sigil was a city unlike anything Nowhere had ever seen. Bustling, alive, and evidently quite prosperous. It was supposed to be riddled with portals, connecting to any place one could imagine in all the worlds of creation. If that was true, it offered unlimited access to anywhere Nowhere might want to go. More important, no one had given him and his horns a second glance since he arrived in the city. He'd seen more tieflings in 5 minutes of scanning the crowd than he'd ever seen in one place in his lifetime. This was a city he thought he could learn to call home. "So, what's the plan?" he asked. Brandis drew a slow breath and let it out deliberately. "I think we need to assume that the others didn't make it through the portal in time, and it's up to us to stop those cultists." "So we just abandon Sharina and the others?" I don't see an alternative. Sharina can take care of herself. All I know of her magical talents, she could be opening another portal right now. Maybe she did make it through and got lost in the crowd the way you almost did. I didn't get lost. I came out in a different place than you did. Brandis shrugged. Whatever. She can handle herself, and if the sword of the gods is with her, then maybe he can lead them right to us. So we need to find those cultists. Right, Brandis said. We know they're heading for Pandemonium. So we need to find a way from here to there. Do you think such a way exists in a place they call the City of Doors? I have to imagine that's why the cultists came here. Nowhere grinned. Follow me, Brandis. This is my speciality. Ulbrich closed his eyes, quieting his thoughts so he could hear the voice of the Elder Elemental Eye, the voice of Tharizdun. He reminded himself, and a renewed thrill of excitement coursed through him. Each time he remembered how his god had spoken through Jeren, the one-eyed leader of Sigil's little cult of thieves, he shuddered with a joyful terror. Jeren stood at his side now, holding Ulbrich's arm, so he didn't fall when the visions came. Even in the City of Doors, Jeren said, finding a way to Pandemonium is no easy task. The Eye will lead us through, Ulbrich said without opening his eyes. He still didn't dare to speak the name of his god aloud. He spoke it in his mind, though, imploring the chained god to lead him. Tharizdun, he called in his thoughts, and fire surged in his body. Tharizdun, lead me! Though his eyes remained closed, a landscape suddenly appeared in his senses. It was a realm of madness, where pulsating globules of liquid flesh floated in the air, wreathed in blue and purple flames. Lightning flashed among them, forming fleeting connections from one to another as eyes and mouths bobbed to the surface and submerged. Shadows of geometric shapes drifted among the blobs, as if a weak and distant sun careened behind impossible structures erected somewhere beyond vision. A translucent tube stretched out before him, undulating slowly as lightning cursed past it, and Ulbrich realized that his mouth opened right beside him. It was a path, the way he was meant to tread. Though it wasn't revealed to his senses, he knew that the tube, which reminded him suddenly of a gullet, constricting impulses that added to its waving motion, opened onto a doorway to Pandemonium. He shook off Jeren's hand and walked into the mouth of the tube, which sprouted teeth like slabs of granite as he passed, ready to close down on any acolyte who proved unworthy. He felt Jeren close at his heels, but the others were beyond his awareness. They might have been among the floating orbs of flesh for all he knew or cared. They were on their own. They would follow or they wouldn't. Tharizdun would ensure that he had acolytes enough for the rite. The tube carried him along without any conscious effort on his part. He had no idea what was happening to his body in the streets of Sigil, nor did he care. Perhaps he was walking along the path laid out for him by Tharizdun, or maybe he was traveling outside of space and time. Once or twice, globules of flesh drifted near the path, and lightning danced around him, but the tube seemed to insulate him, and the flesh globs couldn't hinder his progress along the path. But the tube came to an end, squeezing him out in front of a blazing ring of green flame. Ulbrich opened his eyes. The wretched tenements of the hive were nowhere to be seen. He was in a back alley somewhere, but the surrounding buildings were large, clean, and in good repair. A short stairway up the side of a building led to a door, but the ring of fire corresponded not to the door, but to a decorative arch beside it, at the edge of the landing. The arch, he said, pointing. How do we open the door? Jeren asked. Ulbrich frowned. What? Most of the portals in the City of Doors require a gate key, an object you need that will turn a mundane door or archway into a portal. Without a key, you step through that arch and you're falling 6 feet off the end of the landing. An armored woman opened the door at the top of the stairs and stepped out onto the landing. She held a halberd and took up a stance that clearly signaled her intent to block access to the arch. An instant later, another woman strode out onto a stone bridge that spanned the alley above them. This woman wore flowing robes and carried a slender staff, but her dark hair and eyes were twin to those of the first woman. Albrecht climbed one stair, and the woman with the halberd shifted her stance ever so slightly. "We mean to make use of the portal behind you," he told her. The woman frowned.
I don't know how you learned of it, but our sacred duty is to ward that portal.
"Who appointed you to that duty?"
I am a sworn to Baylor service, my sister to Ions.
Albrecht couldn't explain the rage that welled in his gut, nor was the howl that tore from his throat entirely his. Jaren joined him an instant later, and Albrecht saw both women cover their ears, their faces wrenched in agony. Wailing cries that came from no mortal voice echoed in the alley around them, unearthly and haunting. For a moment, Albrecht saw the two women and his acolytes as more floating globules, and he saw lightning and fire sundering their minds. Thazidun's howls of fury burned in his throat, sucking every last breath of air from his lungs until darkness began to swallow his vision. He fell to his knees, but the two women were already sprawled on the ground, utterly broken. The cry died in his throat and he drew a shuddering breath as Jaren's voice trailed off. Slowly Albrecht got to his feet and climbed the rest of the stairs to the landing. The woman lay insensible, her wide eyes staring at nothing. He bent over her and spoke, his voice raw from screaming. "Who is your god?" A trail of spittle dribbled from the woman's mouth as she answered.
The only god, the chained god, the unknowable and invincible.
"Rise and follow me," Albrecht said. He turned to his acolytes and pointed up to the bridge. "Garrick, get the other one down from there. She will complete our circle." The woman on the landing managed to find her feet, and she stared at the golden symbol of the elemental eye that hung around Albrecht's neck. "What is the gate key that will open this portal?" he asked her.
You wear it already,
she said.
The talisman of the chained god is the key to his former home.
Albrecht smiled. "The eye has led us through." He stepped closer to the arch and darkness began to swirl in the opening. He waited until Garrick had returned with the second sister, and then he stepped through the arch, off the edge of the landing, and into the blackness. Miri wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and cursed herself as she stared, walking down the bustling street. People washed around her like a river flowing both directions at once, sometimes bumping into her, but mostly just passing too close. How did I get so dependent on him, she wondered. She knew the answer though. She depended on Damascus since he first appeared at the dairy where she earned her living, churning cream into butter, lifted her to her feet, and took her away. And before that she had depended on the dairy's owner, dear harsh Karina, who cared for her after her mother was killed. It was no wonder Demas, as she'd grown to call him, thought of her as a child. She had never really grown up. She let the flow of people carry her along the street, searching the crowd in the desperate hope of finding a familiar face. Each time she saw a tiefling. How was it possible that so many tieflings lived in this city? She started thinking it might be the man she had just met in the ruins of Belchereth, the one who called himself Nowhere. Miri chuckled to herself. Where has Nowhere gone? She thought. It's an odd name. Where do you go when you're looking for nowhere? Suddenly, it struck her as less an amusing play on words than a hint of something profound. Searching for nowhere seemed like a metaphor for a worthwhile spiritual pursuit. She wondered what Demas would say about it. Another person in the crowd jostled her, and she realized she had stopped paying attention to her surroundings. The crowd had thinned a little. On her right was a shop displaying bolts of cloth in vibrant colors and exotic patterns, beautifully and creatively woven. Just past that was a tailor shop, its windows sporting gowns and robes made from the same fabrics. She glanced across the street to her left and stopped in her tracks. A small temple stood there, set back from the street and partially hidden by tables and awnings that extended from the sides of the shops that flanked it. 7 wide stairs led up to a narrow doorway between 2 graceful columns, and the entablature above the columns featured the stylized Eye of Iron. It almost seemed impossible, but after all the time she had spent following Demas wherever his god led him, she had to believe that Iron had guided her footsteps to the threshold of this temple. She hurried across the street, up the stairs and between the columns into the chamber within. The noise of the street faded when she entered, and she felt herself start to relax. A statue of Iron dominated the small chamber, depicting her with one hand up in blessing, the other holding an open book. Garlands of wilting flowers were draped over the statue's neck and arms, and Miri wondered if she should go find a fresh sacrifice to offer. She hesitated, realizing she had no idea what she was supposed to do, and turned to leave. 2 smaller statues stood in the corners near the doorway. Twin angels, majestic beings of fire and lightning, lifting their hands in adoration of Iron, ready to receive the blessing of knowledge she dispensed. Was she supposed to adapt the same pose? She stepped closer to examine one of the angels more closely. Its face was blank, just eyes and the suggestion of a nose. But the shape of it, the structure of the cheekbones, the chin, even the ill-defined nose, made her think of Demas. She fell to her knees beside the storm of fire that formed the angel's lower body, her gaze fixed on the angel's blank face.
Demas,
she said. Tears welled in her eyes.
Demas, please hear me. I don't know how to do what you do. Iron won't lead me the way she leads you. I don't know how to find you in this city, and I don't know what else to do.
Sobbing, she leaned forward to rest her head on the statue's cold stone.
Demas, please, just come find me. Let Iron lead you. Surely she can lead you in this, her house. I'll be right here. Just come find me.
Unsure what else to say, Miri curled up on the floor before the angelic statue. With one last look up at the face she imagined to be Demas, she drifted to sleep. A hand on her shoulder brought her gently awake. She opened her eyes to see the angel, a living angel, not the statue. Wreathed in divine light, crouched beside her, his hand on her shoulder and compassion in his pale blue eyes. Miri, get up. As she stood, Miri saw the face of Iron herself behind the angel, serene and severe. An excitement coursed through her like nothing she had ever known, a thrill that ran down her spine and brought tears to her sleepy eyes. Is this how Demas feels when he speaks with Iron? Come, child, we need to hurry, the angel said. We still have to find Brandis and the tiefling. The divine light dimmed as Miri blinked and rubbed her eyes. The angel was smiling, though Iron's face remained impassive. Miri frowned. Angels can't smile, she thought.
Demas?
The glow faded completely and she saw Demas as he was. It was Sharina who stood behind him, not Iron. Miri threw her arms around him, her joy and relief at seeing him tempered by a vague disappointment. Of course, child, Demas said. He slowly, hesitantly put his hands on her back. Who did you think had found you?
I thought you were an angel. I thought.
She clutched him tighter and closed her eyes so she couldn't see Sharina's frown. I thought Iron might speak to me too. The wind that howled around Albrecht was so fierce that for a moment he thought he was falling. He braced himself for impact. Then one of the acolytes bumped into him in the darkness. He stumbled forward and realized that his feet were planted on solid rock. He wheeled a shred of power into his holy symbol and made it glow with a sickly purplish light. The light glittered on flecks of mica scattered over the walls, ceiling, and floor of a tunnel. As he turned in a full circle, the rest of the acolytes appeared in the tunnel, with Jaren bringing up the rear. Each one seemed to step through the solid rock wall, and once Jaren was through, there was no sign of the portal behind him.
How will we get back?
Niala, the elf woman from Jaren's band of thieves, asked. She had to shout to make herself heard over the wind. I would kill you where you stand, Albrecht growled. But the ritual requires 8. When the chained god walks free, you will ask him to carry you back to the slum you left behind. Remember why you are here, worm, and what sacred task lies before us. Nyala fell to her knees at Albrecht's feet.
Forgive me,
she said.
I spoke without thinking.
The twin sisters cackled with a single voice, the sound mingling with a howl of the wind in the tunnel, until Albrecht thought he heard a cacophony of voices. The maddening chorus reminded him of the unearthly voice he'd heard issuing from Jeren's mouth, as well as the howl of fury both men had unleashed to break the sisters' minds. Tharizdun was calling him onward. He put his face to the wind and started down the tunnel. The tunnel coiled to the left, descended sleepily, and then opened into a huge circular vault that could not have been natural in origin. The wind howled less intensely, and 8 pedestals stood arrayed in a circle at the corner of the room. Atop each pedestal sat a crystal orb the size of Albrecht's clenched fist, glowing with purple light. Albrecht walked to the circle and stood behind one of the pedestals, facing the center. He watched with satisfaction as Jeren and the others filed in, taking their positions without a word or a questioning glance. They knew what they were to do. Tharizdun was speaking to them all now. His head swam with realization. They were in the heart of Tharizdun's long-abandoned dominion, the home he had constructed for himself before the Dawn War, before he planted the shard of utter evil in the depths of the elemental chaos that gave birth to the Abyss. Had this vault with its 8 pedestals been standing prepared for this moment since that most ancient time? Had Tharizdun foreseen his imprisonment and the need for 8 acolytes to set him free? They stood like points of a compass, with Jeren facing him across the circle. Garrick and Havar stood on either side of Albrecht, while Jeren's thieves, Nyala and Bragat, flanked their leader. That left the 2 sisters, the former guardians of the portal, facing each other. They all stood still and silent as the wind whipped around them. Albrecht drew the shard of the living gate out of the folds of his robe and stepped to the middle of the circle. He set it carefully in a slight depression that marked the circle's center, then returned to his position. He raised his hands, and the others mirrored the gesture in perfect unison. Their will was gone, replaced by the will of the chained god. He opened his mouth, and 8 voices chanted as one. Tharizdun, god of eternal night, the black sun, behold us gathered in your darkness. The wind seized their voices and scattered them throughout the vaulted cavern, turning 8 voices into 8,000. Tharizdun, ender and anathema, eater of worlds and undoer, come and wreak destruction. The shard of the living gate rose slowly from the floor, as if lifted by the wind, and it began to spin, first slowly, then wildly, wobbling and shaking as it whirled. Tharizdun, patient one, he who waits, chained god, your waiting is over, and your freedom is at hand. The shard's wobbling spin widened until it circled a point in space, about 10 feet above the indentation in the floor. Its orbit grew slowly wider, and as it did, something took shape at the center, a pinprick of utter blackness in the dark chamber. The shard circled still wider, and the pinprick grew to a marble size, then a child's ball, and soon a king's orb of perfect nothingness. The larger the blackness grew, the darker the room became, as if it were a void that drew all light into its emptiness. The void doubled in size once more, and the shard of the living gate clattered to the chamber floor, skittering a few feet towards Garrick. Albrecht fell to his knees as a sensation of power, of presence, of malign majesty and terrible, terrible fury broke over him. The rite worked. Albrecht was certain the void he had created led directly to the prison of the chained god. He was in the presence of the divine. Some of the acolytes cowered on the floor, covering their faces, not daring to lift their eyes to the face of their god. but Albrecht knew their work was not yet finished. The void was too small a passage for Tharizdun to use, but as Albrecht stared in awe, something came through. At first, Albrecht thought it was the blood of his god. It seemed to form on the surface of the black sphere before dripping down in viscous blobs, then pooling together in and around the depression in the floor. It was not blood, Albrecht realized, but rather some kind of liquid crystal, bending and reflecting the feeble light of the orbs. Streaks of silver writhed among flecks of gold inside the substance, and it pulsed and surged as it gathered together in a thick pool on the floor. Albrecht's eyes found the shard of the living gate as the chained god made his will known. Infused with a substance Tharizdun called the progenitor, the shard would form a new living gate, a portal large and strong enough to shatter the walls of his prison and break his chains forever. Albrecht began to crawl towards the shard. But there was another voice in the chamber. "Touch the void, Harald," it whispered. Its voice was the voice of the howling wind, the voice that echoed from every surface of the vaulted hall. "Take it into you, and let it transform you. It will grant you power beyond your imagination." Albrecht hesitated. Was the whisper another expression of Tharizdun's will? While he paused, he saw Haver, Nyala, and both sisters scramble to the edge of the viscous pool, reaching hesitant fingers towards the liquid. "Wait!" he shouted, but the wind stole his voice. When flesh came close to the liquid, the substance rose to meet it, coiling around fingers, then engulfing hands. Serpents of liquid crystal wound up their arms and found ears, nostrils, and screaming mouths as entrances to its acolytes' bodies. The rest of the acolytes looked on, at first in horror, as the bodies of the first four began to change. Albrecht snatched the shard of the living gate from the floor, then looked up to meet Garrick's gaze. "Garrick, help me," he ordered. Garrick nodded and crawled over to Albrecht. "What is the will of the Eye?" he asked. "He wants to fuse that substance, the progenitor, with this shard to make a new living gate. Are you sure?" "Yes, but what the Eye desires and what the progenitor wants do not seem to be the same thing. Come with me." Albrecht cradled the shard of the living gate under one arm as he crawled awkwardly towards the progenitor. Garrick followed, but Albrecht wasn't sure whether he did out of obedience or because he started listening to the liquid whispers. Haver, or a creature that had once been Haver, stepped between Albrecht and the pool. Red crystals jutted from hulking shoulders, and its arms were as thick as tree trunks. Its face was still mostly Haver's, contorted in agony as it transformed, becoming something alien and terrible. Just as Albrecht chanced to fight the creature, it staggered away, racked with the pain of its transformation. "Garrick, hurry!" Albrecht shouted. "Take the shard and touch it to the substance." Garrick's eyes grew wide with fear, but he knew better than to disobey or even question Albrecht. The shard trembled in his grip as he slowly stretched it towards the progenitor liquid. The substance recoiled from the shard, and the whispers in the chamber grew louder, more insistent. "Touch the void, Harald. Let it change you. Witness the power it grants." Jaren's dragon-born acolyte Braggett was the next to succumb to the whispers. He tried to push Garrick away from the pool, but the big man held his ground and thrust the shard of the living gate into the liquid. The shard erupted in brilliant light that cast stark shadows all across the vault. At the same time, a snaky tendril of the substance wound its way up Garrick's arm and into his mouth. Albrecht seized the shard from Garrick's hand and pushed the screaming man away. Jaren stood before him then, madness in his eyes. "Let me help you," he shouted over the echoing whispers. Albrecht eyed him, unsure of his intent. "Help me to do what?" "Open the gate. Free the chained god." Albrecht held out the glowing shard and Jaren gripped it. The progenitor substance was crystallizing around it, expanding it, fusing with it. Albrecht couldn't tell where the original shard stopped, and the hardened progenitor began, or if they were really just one substance. Jaren and Ulbrich gently shaped it as it exploded in size. When it grew large enough, they set it down on the stone floor, and it began to form an arched gateway. The acolytes, still in the throes of transformation, were scattered throughout the chamber, writhing in pain. Hava, though, seemed to be reaching the final stages of metamorphosis. He stood still, hunched forward with massive claws resting on the ground in front of his feet. His face was no longer recognizable as human, let alone as Hava. As Ulbrich's eyes rested on him, he writhed in pain and grew visibly larger. The gate was finished. With one voice, Jaren and Ulbrich chanted another invocation to Tharizdun, the words forming in Ulbrich's mind without any conscious effort. The gate opened, and Ulbrich saw an ever-changing landscape on the other side. It was a maddening procession of worlds, the far end of the gate flitting through them as quickly as he could barely make out the details of a new one. Verdant forest to bare desert, rocky coast to mountain peaks, with no sense of reason or pattern. "We have to focus it," Jaren said. Ulbrich bent his will to the gate, and the flickering landscape slowed ever so slightly. He saw a forbidding city towering over a desolate wasteland, then a city full of graceful towers, with a fire-ringed galleon drifting through the sky above it. Fairy lights danced along a wooded seashore. As he watched, something wrapped around his ankle. It was warm and firm, more like flowing sand than an ooze. Its touch sent tiny pinpricks of pain across his skin as it coiled its way up his leg. He looked down and saw that the progenitor pool had split into two long tendrils, one of which was riding up his leg as the other did the same to Jaren. Peering around the edge of the gate, he met Jaren's gaze and nodded. First things first, they must free the chained god. Void Harrow.
What has happened?
The chained god's form became a dark whirlwind of fury, scattering the progenitor into crystalline mist.
You betrayed me.
Betray, the progenitor whispered, its echoes surrounding him.
They would have freed me.
They freed us, the whispers replied. Now we spread your will and my substance, the Void Harrow. The chained god began to see.
Like a plague,
he said. Plague, a plague.
Your substance and my will.
Our will. The chained god's fury diminished, and he reached his thoughts to his old dominion, where the Void Harrow had taken root. Yes, his will was present there, the merest echo of his thoughts and desires. It was more of a foothold in the universe he'd left behind than he'd ever had, though.
It is enough,
he said. Like a plague.
I hate to interrupt this touching reunion,
Sharina's cold voice said.
but you agreed to help me find my companions once we'd found yours.
Miri released her hold on Demas, and his hands dropped from her back. Miri's eyes stung as she realized that his half-hearted embrace was the most demonstrative expression of his care for her that he'd ever given, and she'd had warmer embraces from innkeepers. Something in Sharina's tone irritated her just enough that she turned her frustration to the Eladrin wizard.
Is that all it is to you?
She said.
An exchange of services? Of course.
Sharina said.
What else would it be? Aren't you worried about them? They can take care of themselves.
Miri couldn't be sure, but she thought that Sharina put the slightest emphasis on the word they, as if to suggest a contrast between her competent companions and Miri, who had reacted to being separated from her companions by cowering in a temple.
Don't you care about them?
She asked.
Don't you think they might be worried about you? As my original statement conveyed, I am eager to find them. Brandis and Nowhere are my associates, and very valuable ones. However, I assure you I won't greet them with a tearful embrace when we find them. Your associates.
Miri could hardly believe what she was hearing.
Of course. We cooperate together to accomplish specific tasks for which our particular skills are suited. Each of us brings different strengths to the group, and we cover each other's weaknesses. It's a lucrative line of work, and we divide the profits equally. It's not so different from a trading venture. I can't imagine what else I would call them. Friends, you trust your life to them.
Sharina shrugged.
The same is true of partners of any sort of high-risk adventure. And what do they call you? The same thing, I imagine. Even Nowhere.
For the first time, Sharina's perfect composure slipped just a fraction.
What do you mean?
Miri smiled.
The look in his eyes when you're around doesn't say associate to me.
Sharina's face froze, and Miri felt the temperature in the temple drop.
Enough,
she said, and Miri could see the Eladrin's breath in the suddenly frosty air.
I have no need to be chided by a half-elf child with stars in her teary eyes. Damascus promised to help me find my associates, so they and I can continue the task set before us. As soon as he has fulfilled his end of the bargain, I shall take my leave and hope that our paths never cross again.
A sudden flare of light and warmth drove away Sharina's chill as Gemma stepped between the two women, his face stern. That's enough, wizard. Miri may be young, but I have seen more proof of her valor and strength than I have yet seen from you. I am proud to call her a dear friend, and I can't stand by and let you insult her. Miri's heart sank as the wizard's frosty glare softened.
I am sorry,
Sharina said.
Perhaps I am more concerned about my associates than I was willing to admit, and my concern has shortened my temper.
Let us find them then, Gemma said, if only that we may part ways sooner. Nowhere stepped out of the rowdy tavern, and a bottle smashed on the cobblestones by his feet. Without a glance back, he hurried out of the alley, smiling broadly. When he reached the thoroughfare where he was to meet Brandis, his eyes lit on the sword of the gods first. Even in the cosmopolitan streets of the city of doors, Damascus stood out like a troll at a banquet. Sharina and Miri walked beside him, one on each side. Sharina, he called, and changed course to meet them. He saw Sharina's face brighten. Then he brought it under control, and shot Miri a dark glance. What was that about? Brandis emerged from an alley across the street, and Nowhere waved to catch his eye. You found us, he said as he drew near enough to be heard. The group met in front of a potter's shop, but Miri stood a few paces away from the others, her gaze fixed on Damascus. What happened? He asked.
The portal was unstable,
Sharina said.
As soon as the cultists had passed, it started to close. Before it did, though, the far end of the portal, the one in this city, started to slip. For each of you that went through, your destination fell back a significant distance. I suspect even Brandis never saw the cultists.
That's right, the paladin said. Sharina and I used our magic to stabilize the portal and hold it open, Damascus said. Then we set about collecting our associates.
The sword of the gods drew on Ion's wisdom to lead us, first to Miri, then here,
Sharina said.
His abilities really are uncanny.
We could use those abilities, Brandis said. Are you still interested in chasing those cultists? Damascus glanced at Miri. Our mission has failed, he said. Ion sent us to Baal Cherith to destroy the Staff of Opening before it fell into evil hands, but we were too late. I would like to correct that failure. Miri scowled and looked away from the group. For that matter, Sharina didn't look too pleased at his words. Brandis smiled, apparently oblivious to the two women. We believe they're on their way to put that staff to use. If Sharina's right, and I have no doubt that she is, the staff you seek incorporates a shard of the living gate. They plan to use that shard to open a doorway into the prison of the chained god. They seek to free the undoer, Damascus said. Nowhere shuddered as a chill shot through him. He hadn't heard that title before, but it brought to mind the sense of a dark god unraveling everything. reversing mortal achievements and bringing plans to ruin. He glanced at Sharina and found her eyes on him. She looked distracted, and he gave her a quizzical smile. She looked away. We believe they're heading for Pandemonium to perform their ritual, so Nowhere has been asking around, trying to find out where you go if you want to get from the City of Doors here to the Howling Wastes there. Ion will lead us, Damascus said. Nowhere bit his tongue, fighting down the urge to say something pointed or draw his dagger. He couldn't deny that Damascus' gifts were useful, but did he have to be so sanctimonious about them? The sword of the gods struck him as the worst kind of zealot, the kind of follower who'd never learned to stand on his own feet because he trusted the gods to hold him upright, and then had the gall to reproach others for not living as he did. He thought he understood why Sharina didn't look pleased that Damascus wanted to tag along on their adventure. Miri turned to Sharina, though her eyes were fixed on the ground.
I'm sorry,
she said.
I didn't mean to chide.
So they had fought. That explained the tension in the air and the angry glances. Sharina looked taken aback, but quickly regained her composure.
No, I'm sorry if I insulted you,
she said. Together then, Brandis said, beaming around his companions. Damascus, lead on. The sword of the gods closed his eyes and took one firm step. Then his eyes opened wide in shock. He clutched his hands to his ears and fell to his knees.
Damas,
Miri cried, rushing to his side. What is it? The sword of the gods stared blankly as if he hadn't heard. Nowhere searched the street and what he could see of adjoining buildings, looking for a fleeing assassin or some other explanation for Damascus' sudden collapse. Damas, I am all right, he said at last. I saw the doorway we seek, but I cannot lead us there. Why not? Brandis demanded. There was a scream, and Nowhere gaped at Damascus. He'd never seen the sword of the gods at a loss for words, or appearing anything but supremely confident. But something had shaken him. It's all right, Nowhere said. I can get us to the portal. He drew a silver charm from his pouch, a depiction of a bent spiral, the Elder Elemental Eye. I even got us a key. Pain convulsed Albrecht's body, shattering his focus and making the image within the gate shift more rapidly. He looked down and saw the progenitor completely covering his lower body, and he could feel it starting up his spine. He couldn't feel his legs at all, and he realized that his left leg was liquefied. A column of the silver scarlet liquid supported his body. Albrecht! Jaren's voice jolted him out of his shock, and he forced his attention back to the gate. The image stabilized again, showing the gleaming streets of a celestial city. A moment later it shifted to a range of brooding mountains, then a castle with soaring spires, its walls fluttering with blue pennants. Tharisdun, he muttered through his pain. Ender an anathema, eater of worlds. With each second the gate revealed a new world to his eyes. The chained god, once free, would tear through them all like a bullet, scattering anthills when it burrowed up from the earth. He would consume them, and each life he extinguished would feed the furnace of his power. Undoer, he grunted, come and wreak destruction. Wreak destruction, Jaren echoed, shouting through his own agony. Destruction, whispered a third voice. It was all around, and in Albrecht's mind, it might have been his own voice. He recognized it as the voice of the Void Harrow. That's its name. What Tharisdun called the progenitor, Tharisdun doesn't know. Tharisdun knows all. Jaren screamed and staggered away from the gate, clutching his face. He dug his fingertips into the empty eye socket, trying in vain to pull the Void Arrow out. The gate flickered again, showing him a dozen worlds in the span of his glance, a dozen worlds that would be destroyed by the coming of the chained god. Let them burn, he growled, and he bent his will to steady the gate once more. Nowhere stepped through the arch first, the spiral symbol glowing slightly as it activated the portal's magic. An oblivion of darkness and silence seized him, and he felt nothing. No wall within his reach, no ground beneath his feet, no breath of air on his skin. A presence appeared at his shoulder, invisible in the darkness, and a voice croaked in his ear.
You proceed to your doom.
Nowhere's body bent cold with terror, and he recognized the voice of Tevet the Heartless, the night hag of Nerath's Undercity. What is she doing here, he thought.
Have you tired of hunting this Hydra yet, Tiefling?
Tevet asked. Her voice set him on edge, reminding him of every unexplained noise that ever frightened him in the night. The profit's been small the last few days, I must admit. Nowhere tried to sound more cavalier than he felt, but his voice sounded small and fragile in his own ears. Where are the others? He thought. They were right behind me.
And you're about to lose it all. What a pity.
A hot flare of anger started to thaw his terror. What are you doing here, Tevet? Aren't you a long way from home?
Not as far as you are, Tiefling. I'm here to save you.
Save me? Why?
Silly child, you bring meat and blood. You're one of my best customers. I'd be heartbroken if anything happened to you.
Her croaking laugh came from all around him. I have no cow's heart to pay with now, Tevet. What price would you ask for saving me? He knew the answer, but he had to hear her say it.
I told you before. I want Sharina.
Nowhere thrust his dagger backwards into the empty air, where he thought the night hag stood. Her laugh grew louder and sharper, until it felt like a harsh winter wind, buffeting him on all sides. I told you before, he said through clenched teeth. I won't hand her over to you, not even to save my own life.
Suit yourself. Perhaps I won't be so heartbroken after all.
Tevet's laughter became a howling wind, and a stone floor beneath his feet, and his shoulder slammed into a rough wall. The faintest glimmer of light filtered up from somewhere below, just barely enough to trace the outline of a tunnel to his infernally enhanced senses. An instant later, bright light stabbed at his eyes, and he saw Damascus standing like a beacon, divine radiance shining from his staff and enveloping his body without casting a shadow. Miri appeared in the tunnel next, then Sharina, and finally Brandis in quick succession. What took you all so long? Nowhere whispered. Looks of confusion flitted across every face. Then Brandis laughed, dismissing the question as a joke. Nowhere swallowed hard. Tevet must have snared him somewhere in between the portal in Sigil and its destination, turning an instantaneous journey into an opportunity for that disturbing conversation. To his companions, no time had passed. A long, wordless howl echoed up the tunnel from somewhere below, carried on the rushing wind. It sounded like a tormented beast, and it did nothing to soothe Nowhere's nerves. What am I doing here, he thought. This isn't worth dying for. He let Brandis and the glowing torch of the gods lead them way down the tunnel, staying back near the edge of Damascus' circle of light, so he could duck into shadow at the first sight of trouble. The two of them set a pace that was more eager than safe, as more howls, screams, and shouts filtered up the tunnel. I'll break, someone cried. A bestial squeal answered the cry. Whatever the cultists were doing, it didn't sound good. Nowhere wondered if the ritual had gone awry, or if it had succeeded in summoning a powerful being that failed to show the proper gratitude for its liberation. He realized he was clutching his dagger too tightly to use, and he tried to relax his grip. Brandis and Damascus paused as they reached the end of the tunnel, and Nowhere tried to peer around them to get a clear view of the vaulted chamber beyond. An archway formed of scarlet crystal stood in the center of the room, shedding a dim red light around it. Through the arch, Nowhere could just make out an unfamiliar city, with a tall black tower rising above it. One man stood beside the arch, gripping the crystal with two hands, while wailing in evident pain. His lower body was covered with a substance that looked like a liquid version of the crystal that formed the arch, shot through with flecks of gold and veins of silver. One tendril of the liquid stretched up his spine. 7 other figures were spread across the large chamber, none of them fully human. One was a 6-armed Hulk with red crystal formations jutting from its back and shoulders. Another was a pain-racked elf face at the center of a teeming mass of crystalline spiders. A dragon-born man clutched his own wrist and, as Nowhere watched, exhaled a cloud of fire to engulf his crystal-covered hand. The fire clung to his hand, drawing a scream of pain and fear from the dragonborn's mouth. "Minions of the chained god!" Damascus shouted. His voice filled the huge chamber and echoed through it, silencing even the wind for an instant. "You stand under the judgment of all the gods, and the sword of the gods has come to execute that judgment." "And I didn't think he could get any more arrogant and self-righteous," Nowhere muttered. Sharina heard him and smiled.
"Shall we?"
she said. Nowhere frowned. No pile of gold waited to be claimed in the chamber. In fact, what gold he could see, gleaming around the neck of the man by the arch, was in imminent danger of being swallowed by the liquid crystal. Nowhere was pretty sure he didn't want to touch that stuff. Tavet's warning stuck in his mind. "You proceed to your own doom." Why, he wondered. Why should I die here? Sharina didn't wait for his answers. Stepping into the mouth of the tunnel, she stretched her hands and hurled waves of fire into the chamber ahead of Brandis's charge. That's why, he thought. Damn it. He drew a deep breath to steady his nerves. As he slipped past Sharina and into the chamber, he rested his hand on her shoulder for a moment. She shot him a puzzled smile even as gleaming bolts of magical energy shot from her fingertips to plunge into the 6-armed monster that was lumbering towards her. The cultists and monsters were in confused disarray, especially the ones who were still caught in the transformation from one to the other. Brandis intercepted the hulking thing, ensuring that it kept its distance from Sharina, while Miri charged around to the left and attacked the creature with human legs, plated armor, and the 4 quarters of a panther-like monster, sleek and predatory. Damascus drew the sword from his back as he rushed straight towards the arch. As he moved, a column of divine fire roared down over the archway and the 3 nearest cultists. Nowhere scowled. Brandis and Miri wore heavy armor, and each of them had picked out one foe to deal with. Damascus wore chainmail beneath his ornate robes, but he was heading for the thickest concentration of foes and seemed most likely to need Nowhere's help. Keeping to the shadows, he circled slowly around to the outside of the chamber, his eyes fixed on the nearest cultist. A cultist whose left hand was covered with a scarlet liquid moved to intercept Damascus. He held a sword and swung it wildly at the cleric, who blocked it with an easy parry. "You," Damascus said. "I saved your life in Baal Tereth." The cultist didn't answer, but his left hand moved to his throat, as if of its own volition. "And this is how you respond to the grace of the gods freely given to you," Damascus said. The liquid crystal that swathed the man's hand extended a snaky tendril and found his mouth. He started to scream, but the liquid choked the sound off. His lips twisted in disgust. Damascus cut the man's head from his neck with one clean stroke of his sword. A spray of blood and droplets of red crystal-lined liquid trailed from the edge of his sword. Across the room, Miri killed the panther-like creature before it fully completed its transformation. An orb of greenish goo hurtled from Sharina's hand and splashed into the 6-armed Hulk as Brandis' glowing sword whirled around it in a deadly dance, wearing down its defenses. Damascus advanced to the next cultist, but he hesitated as he realized that the man was too racked with agony to even acknowledge his presence. Nowhere stalked out the shadows to approach the cultist from the other side, and saw that the man was clawing at an eye socket that was filled with a liquid substance. The sword of the gods was reluctant to kill a man who posed no immediate threat, but Nowhere felt no such compunctions. As the tiefling thrust his dagger forward, the man's body jerked out of the way as if yanked away by some unseen hand. His good eye, wide with fright, focused on Nowhere as he stumbled through the arch. With a flash of crimson light, the man disappeared into a desert landscape under a dark red sun. Nowhere paused, not sure whether he should try to follow, He glanced at Damascus, who seemed uncharacteristically hesitant. As he looked back to the archway, though, he realized that his decision had been made for him. In place of the desert landscape, he now saw a dark forest with a wooded island of earth and stone floating in the air above it. Another creature swept in, this one no longer recognizable as the cultist it had been. Its body was formed of shadow, though crystalline structures extended from its back like wings and swirled around its legs in long, twisting tendrils that lifted it off the ground. As it moved closer, Nowhere felt a pressure in his mind, as if the monster were sifting through his thoughts. He threw a dagger at the creature, but the blade flew wide and clattered on the stone. Then he heard the croaking cackle of Tevet the Heartless, and turned to see the night hag standing right behind him, tearing her claws into Sharina's lifeless corpse. "No!" he screamed, recoiling from the hag's bloody grin. Then he heard a grunt of pain from the direction of the shadow creature, and Tevet seemed to flicker for a moment. In place of Tevet, he saw a smear of darkness in the air, and he glanced around to see Sharina standing several paces behind Damascus, launching another arcane barrage at the creature. Damascus, too, looked like he was pulling himself out of his own nightmarish vision, and he was visibly shaken. Nowhere growled his rage. The creature had dredged his mind and woven his worst nightmares into a weapon to use against him. Even as he rushed towards the monster, he felt the pressure on his mind again, but he honed his fury to drive the nightmare weaver's tendrils out of his thoughts, and the pressure faded completely as his dagger slashed into the creature's shadowy substance. A blast of fire from Sharina's fingers engulfed the creature, stopping inches from Nowhere's face and bathing him in waves of heat as it roared over the nightmare creature's body. With a shout and a flash of light, Damascus drove his sword deep into its shoulder. With the last of his anger, Nowhere pushed the smoldering body as it fell, sending it tumbling through the arch and into the dark forest of another world. He looked around to get a sense of the tide of battle. It seemed to be going in their favor. Brandis had toppled the four-armed Hulk, and he and Miri were locked in battle with a creature formed of fire, with a pulsing core of liquid crystal at its heart. The dragon-born cultist, whose fiery breath had given birth to the creature, was dead on the floor nearby. Near the archway, only one cultist remained, the human with crystalline legs, who looked like he was still trying to manipulate the portal. As Nowhere looked at the gate, though, he saw the cultist monster he'd forgotten. The chittering swarm of spiders was in the process of forming itself into a single creature, forming a sheath of black chitin around itself and shaping it into spindly legs and a bulbous body. While the swarm creature was still gathering its strength, Nowhere stepped forward to deal with the cultist at the arch. He moved up behind the man, who had somehow remained completely focused on the arch as battle erupted around him. He saw the liquid crystal pulsing on the man's spine and undulating where his legs had once been. He struck out with a dagger in hatred and revulsion, driving the blade up beneath the man's ribs. The man's head and shoulders slumped, but the quivering column of liquid crystal kept the corpse upright. Nowhere stepped back, but the liquid lashed out at him. The pain had all but stopped as the void harrow fused with Ulbricht's spine. He was so intent on turning the portal to free the chained god that even the destruction of half of his body failed to deter him, and though there was a brief battle of wills, he had bent the void harrow to his own purpose. Then the dagger slipped into his side, piercing a lung in his heart, and Ulbricht's mortal body died in the span of 3 heartbeats. He was not Ulbricht any longer, but neither was he only the void harrow. He saw, though, not with Ulbricht's eyes any longer. He saw the corpses of the others, and other exarchs of the void harrow, the former acolytes of Ulbricht, strewn here and there on the floor of the chamber, clots and puddles of liquid crystal flowing back from the bodies to pool in the center of the room. Ulbricht's plans, the chained god's plans, and even the void harrow's plans all lay in ruin, thanks to the interference of these 5 mortals. He saw the one who had stabbed him, recoiling in fear and disgust, and reached his substance to seize that body. The scream pleased him. the terror and pain given voice as he found his way into the body and made it his. It was different than Albric's form, stronger and faster. The mind was quicker too, and he could make use of it as he crushed its will with his own.
Nowhere!
The female wizard was bending over him, concern on her face. The dagger had fallen from his grip, so he used his bare hand, focusing all his strength into one blow that drove her off him and slammed her against the wall. He got to his feet and surveyed the wreckage of the chamber. The man's name had been nowhere, and now he was nothing. He shaped the muscles of the face into something like a smile.
I am New Eileen,
he declared. Miri shot Brandis a smile. She liked fighting alongside the paladin. They were coordinating well together, even without speaking. More importantly, she realized Brandis was relying on her. He trusted her to keep up her end of the partnership, which she could never really say about Demas. The Sword of the Gods was nothing if not confident, and while he certainly deserved to feel sure of himself, it often left her feeling like an unnecessary appendage, a child, tagging along at the whim of the champion. Together, they easily defeated the strange elemental creature formed of the Dragonborn's fiery breath. Brandis loaned her some of his own divine power, making her axe shine like a shard of the sun, which seemed to make the creature in its pulsating liquid heart more susceptible to her attacks. Brandis drew it out so she could strike the killing blow, slicing cleanly through its heart and scattering the glowing embers of its substance. She wanted to say something to Brandis, to communicate her appreciation, but as she sought for the right words, his gaze drew her eyes to the others, across the room. Only one monster remained, an enormous spider-like creature of glossy black chitin, with scarlet crystal visible in the spaces between plates. As she started, it clambered on top of the arch and crouched, ready to pounce down on Demas. At the same moment, Sharina flew backward from Nowhere's prone body, as if hurled by some enormous strength. Brandis and Miri broke into a run at the same moment. All Miri could think of was what Brandis had said to Demas when they met. "You are chasing your doom." As they ran, the spider thing leaped, crashing into Demas and knocking him to the ground. Crystals flew from his body with impact, then skidded around to swarm over Demas's body. "Iron, protect me!" he shouted, and he erupted with a burning light as bright as the sun. The larger creature staggered back as the crystal spiders crawling over Demas melted into tiny puddles of scarlet liquid. Nowhere, who had found his feet, also recoiled from the light. His movement seemed stiff and awkward, and the snarl that twisted his face looked like nothing she'd seen from the tiefling before. He strode towards Demas, and Miri quickened her run to intercept him. He met her charge with a backhanded swing that knocked her off her feet and sent her crashing into the arch. She felt the energies of the arch crackling around her, and a gentle pull starting to draw her through into the dark forest on the other side. Her head was swimming from the force of Nowhere's blow, but she kept enough presence of mind to drag herself away from the arch before it could pull her through to whatever world lay beyond. Brandis and Demas assaulted the spider creature from opposite sides, but it didn't seem the least bit trouble to fight on two fronts at once. Spindly chitinous legs slashed at Demas as more crystalline spiders swarmed over Brandis, keeping clear of the deadly divine nimbus that surrounded the Sword of the Gods. Both men seemed oblivious to Nowhere and the threat he presented. Sharina was not. She'd been hit even harder than Miri was, and her face showed the mark of it as she pulled herself to her feet again. She met Miri's eyes and nodded. Gripping her axe, she rushed at Nowhere again, more cautiously this time. He ignored her, stooping to retrieve a dagger from the floor as he continued walking towards Demas.
Nowhere!
She shouted. He spared her little more than a glance.
Nowhere is gone,
he said, his voice strange, the words stilted. Sharina used the brief distraction to utter a brief incantation that sent bolts of lightning cascading from her fingertips to engulf Nowhere's form. His body arched with pain, and his eyes met Miri's for an instant. In that moment she thought she saw Nowhere again, not whatever force was controlling his body, a look of sadness replacing the twisted fury on his face.
Nowhere!
She called again.
Fight it! You can do it!
No, he cannot.
Nowhere's body said. Miri's voice drew Demas's attention, and he shifted so he could see both the spider thing and Nowhere, finally recognizing the tiefling as an enemy. Brandy struck a mighty blow that flared with divine radiance, and the chitin shell shattered under the force of it. Tiny red spiders scattered in a wave that washed over Demas, sending him staggering backwards.
No!
Miri screamed. Demas stumbled back and hit the arch, sparking a flare of crimson light as the image inside the arch flickered. Hundreds of the crystal spiders vanished through the archway as Demas fought to regain his balance. Terror distorted his normally serene countenance, a fear like Miri had never seen on his face. Brandis dropped his sword and grabbed Demas's arm. Then Nowhere leaped. He covered 5 yards as easy as a single step, slamming onto Demas's body when he landed. He pushed the sword of the gods out of Brandis's grip and through the arch, sending Brandis sprawling on the floor with one mighty kick, then swept his arm through both supports of the arch. Miri dove for the arch too late. The forest scene winked out as the arch collapsed, sealing Demas in whatever world lay beyond. Cold fear and despair gripped her heart. How did everything go wrong so quickly, she thought. We were doing so well. Scarlet light blazed from the wrecked arch to cast Nowhere's huge shadow across the vault as he faced the wizard.
Sharina,
he said.
He had such strong feelings for you.
Nowhere's hand twitched sharply, and he looked sharply down at it.
Once I kill you, his resolve will be shattered.
So he's still fighting, Miri thought. Fighting against this thing's control, whatever it is.
How do we fight this thing?
She asked aloud.
Can we get it out of nowhere without killing him?
Brandis got slowly to his feet, obviously in a lot of pain. He looked to Sharina.
I have an idea.
Sharina said.
But it's not a very good idea. Right now it's all we have.
Miri said. The tiefling was fighting hard for control of his body, much harder than Nualeen had expected. He struggled to keep the body under control and to make sure that no sign of the struggle was visible on the 3 enemies he faced. He could not display his weakness. Nowhere felt like he was deep underwater, struggling to reach the surface as his lungs burned for air. The thing, whatever it was that had seized his body, was getting ready to kill Sharina, using his body. He couldn't let that happen. A spasm went through the body as Nualeen's control wavered. He saw the wizard, Sharina, raise her hands and chant the syllables of a spell. He tried to leap at her, to strike her and disrupt the energies of her spell before she could cast it, but the body would not respond. He took a few staggering steps forward, then Sharina's spell took effect. Motes of grey-blue light danced around Nowhere's body, and Nualeen felt it stiffen. The magic hindered his control and seemed to help the tiefling exert his own will. Nualeen began gathering his energy and his essence, preparing to leave this body and claim another if the battle took a turn for the worst. Sharina! Without Nualeen's consent, the lips formed her name, and the breath gave it voice. Nualeen could no longer collect sense information from the lower part of the body, nor could he move the legs to walk. Sharina stepped close. He tried to strike her, to drive her away, but the arms would not respond to his commands. Water streaked Sharina's face. Nualeen didn't understand it. He tried to probe the tiefling's thoughts, but found them close to him. He pulled his substance in the tiefling's throat, but he found his own form congealing, thickening, growing slower and less responsive to his will.
What has she done?
Her lips brushed the tiefling's mouth, and the last bit of sensation he experienced from the body was the softness of them as they touched his. Nowhere's flesh was hard, unyielding, dead. It was stone, and his own substance was crystallizing as well. Too late, he tried to expel himself from the tiefling's mouth, but the stone mouth was closed. No exit remained to him, and then he too was stone. I have failed, he thought, but someday, somehow, I will finish what we have begun. I swear it by the chained god and the void harrow. Then he thought no more.